Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the third of a three-part series of webinars from Paragon Vision Sciences and Contact Lens Centre of Australia. Upon completion of the webinar, we will follow up with an email including a link to register for the contact lens fitting and myopia workshop to be held one day prior to the OSO, Thursday, September 22nd. This is a great opportunity to receive instruction from industry-leading instructors Ken Kopp, Russell Lowe, and Randy Kojima. In appreciation of your attendance this evening, Contact Lens Centre of Australia will be offering a 10% discount on the Paragon CRT contact lens diagnostic dispensing system, including the extended set and dual access. I'm Angela Kasparek, the Practice Management Consultant with Paragon Vision Sciences. I'm pleased to be with you today and have this opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Randy Kojima. Randy is a globally recognized key opinion leader in the orthokeratology industry. He is the Clinical Research and Development Director for Precision Technology based in Vancouver, Canada, as well as a research scientist and clinical instructor at Pacific University College of Optometry in Forest Grove, USA. Randy will be answering your questions following the presentation. The presentation tab is located on the control panel to the right of your screen. Please join me in welcoming Randy.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining us today and for listening in on this great topic related to orthokeratology. And topography is one of those tools that we all know is absolutely critical for the practice of specialty contact lenses and especially orthokeratology in the CRT design. So this talk should be about how we can use the topographer with the CRT system and orthokeratology in general, and we'll hopefully give you some pearls that you can use to take back to your practice. So how important is keratometry readings in the practice of Orho-k, and is a topographer necessary in the beginning, the construction of the lenses, let's say? So let's look at strengths and weaknesses of K readings, and we know with keratometry we get two data points effectively, and really the keratometer does one important thing for us, and it measures corneal astigmatism. But by comparison to corneal topography, we're getting thousands of data points with a computerized corneal topographer. We're getting the power of the eye, the shape of the eye, the elevation of the eye. We're getting so much more than just having the central corneal astigmatism. And when we consider the diameter of measure of K readings, it sure makes sense that we're getting a fairly limited amount of information to begin the construction of any lens. Of course, depending on how steep or flat the eye is, the keratometer or the Sim-K reading is going to estimate a diameter of about 3 millimeters, and it gives us nothing inside of 3 millimeters and nothing outside of 3 millimeters. So it can be relatively erroneous when we're dealing with more irregular eyes or larger diameter lenses, because of course if we're measuring just a 3 millimeter ring of the central area of the cornea, if we're trying to construct a 10-5 orthokeratology lens or a custom soft lens, or especially in a scleral lens, 3 millimeters of the center can be of relatively limited value. So one of the things that we do today is still use K readings and not true elevation of the cornea. So the flat K reading, while limited, is our tool that we use to construct many of the lenses. So how important is it for us to take a really accurate K reading? Let's take this cornea. We've got a flat K of 793 and an eccentricity of 0.6. So the rate of flattening of the eye is 0.6. The central corneal curvature is in the neighborhood of 793. Now, how does that eye compare to this eye? If we have the same eccentricity of 0.6, but now a flat K reading of 778, slightly steeper. What if we compare that eye to another cornea, a little bit steeper, 762, but the same eccentricity? So let's bring all of these eyes together and compare how they might be different. Now, of course, 793 cornea is a much flatter eye, 762 a much steeper eye, 778 right in the middle. If all three of these eyes have a 0.6 eccentricity, if they all have the same rate of flattening, what does that mean to the overall depth of contact lens that we're going to require? And in the case of our flattest cornea, the depth of the cornea is around 1738 microns. So think of the cornea like a mountain. How high is the mountain? And what you're going to do with the CRT lens is think of the eye similarly. How high is the mountain? So for this particular eye, 1738, if we were to use or if we were to be fitting a patient that has a central radius slightly steeper, what does that work out to be? About 0.15 millimeters steeper, not even a diopter steeper. The depth of the eye increases to 1790. So that's a difference of 52 microns higher in height by just a central radius that's steeper, only 0.15 millimeters. If we were to go steeper still, about 1.6 millimeters, 0.16 millimeters steeper, now the height is increased to another 41 microns higher. So what does this mean to go from 1738 to 1790, that's 52 microns, or to go from 1790 to 1831, that's 41 microns. So what? What's 50 something and 40 microns? Well, in an Ortho-k lens, you're targeting 0.05 to, you're targeting 5 to 10 microns central thickness. So 40 or 50 microns is a humongous amount of error in the construction of our lenses. So the K reading is a very important value in the overall determination of your initial lens. Now the second factor that is important in the construction of a proper fitting rigid contact lens, and especially the CRT, is the eccentricity, the shape factor, or the asphericity. And what these describe is the corneal shape beyond the central K readings, beyond the central 3 millimeters that we talked about. It's describing how the normal non-surgical eye generally goes from steepest in the center to flattest toward the periphery. It's describing how the eye shape changes more mathematically as opposed to just saying the cornea is steep, median, or flat. It's a way of describing the cornea to understand the global shape of the eye, or at least one of the ways that we might do that. So how does this eccentricity contribute to our orthokeratology lenses? How does it contribute to the construction of the CRT as an example? So the important value that we want to know is how steep is the central cornea, but then how does the cornea change from this point out to this point where the lens might land? And that's seen on the graph down below, from steepest in the center, flattest in the periphery, steepest in the center, flattest in the periphery. So let's take some cases. Here's a patient with a flat K of 7.83 millimeters and a 0.2 eccentricity. What will that mean to the height of the eye? Well, this particular eye with these radii and eccentricity combinations would result in a height of 1774 microns. Let's take another cornea, very similar in radii, 7.82, but now the eccentricity has gone up to 0.49. So that makes the sagittal depth 1764 microns. What if we take another cornea, 7.82 millimeters, again a very similar flat K, but the eccentricity has now gone up to 0.65, and that makes the sagittal depth 1744. So what does this all mean? Let's bring them all together and compare them. All three of these eyes have the same central radii of curvature. They have the same flat K, but each one of them has a different rate of flattening, 0.2 all the way up to 0.65. So the highest rate of flattening is your largest number, the 0.65. Now let's compare the heights between these eyes. With the lowest eccentricity, we have the highest sagittal depth, 1774. When we increase eccentricity, keeping the central radii the same, that results in a drop in sagittal depth down to 1764. So we've lost 10 microns by increasing the eccentricity. If we go from 0.49 eccentricity to 0.65, same radii of curvature in the center, but that now drops the sagittal depth, 20 microns between a 0.49 eccentricity and a 0.65 eccentricity. So the E-value is important too. It's not just the central radii of curvature. Eccentricity is going to contribute to the success or failure of our initial lens selection. So taking accurate readings, accurate topography is critical to our success moving forward before we've even started with Orho-k, before we've allowed that patient to take the lens home. Eccentricity also factors in terms of the higher the E-value, the greater the potential for Ortho-k change. And this study by Mountford and Nowak going back to 97, and I believe they had a follow-up study shortly after that backed up their initial data, suggested that the flatter the cornea, the lower the potential for Ortho-k change. The steeper the cornea, the higher the potential for Ortho-k change. So ideally, the best patient in CRT lenses is one that's both steep in radii and high in eccentricity. And the reason for that is orthokeratology sphericalizes the central cornea. Aspherical surface would be an E-value of 0. So if the cornea is moving towards 0, when we create Ortho-k, the farther it is to start away from 0 is a better candidate for Ortho-k treatment. So the higher the E-value and the steeper the cornea, the better the potential for Ortho-k change. Another thing that a topographer is valuable to assist us with our CRT lenses is corneal diameter. For instance, does it make sense to use a 10.6 lens on a cornea that has a visible iris diameter of only 10.4 millimeters? Similarly, should we be using a 10.6 on a cornea that's 13 millimeters in diameter? I have to admit, at the school where I work at Pacific University, the CRT is the lens that we use most frequently, and to be honest, we don't look at visible iris diameter right off the bat as often as we should. Often, when things go wrong, it's something we refer to after and say, why didn't we pay attention to visible iris diameter to start? As an example, if the patient was struggling with comfort, we would have noticed that we were putting a 10.6 on a cornea that's much smaller and possibly the edge would be impinging. So that would have told us, if we would have checked for VID beforehand, maybe we should be custom ordering the right diameter of lens before we send the patient home with it. Similarly, if we put a small diameter on a big cornea like a 13 millimeter and we come back the next day and find that the patient has a massive amount of decentration or central islands, that's most likely because we had the wrong diameter of lens for this particular cornea. So pay attention to VID. It's one of those things that can help you in achieving success, especially if things went a little bit sideways. It's usually one of the great indicators of what change we need to make to the lens. So in constructing our lenses, the three things that we want to focus on with our topographer is getting an accurate central radii of curvature, an accurate flat K. Second thing is we want to understand the shape factor of the eye, the rate of flattening of the eye. Is this a good candidate for Ortho-k? Is it a patient with an E-value of 0.2 and an RX of -5? If so, maybe this isn't the best candidate for the lens. And similarly, if we have a very small or very large cornea, we may want to factor that into our initial determination of lens specifications. And this is something that the Contact Lens Center of Australia can be really beneficial in helping you walk through and determine the right initial parameters. Now, when we start Ortho-k, the entry point is topography and getting a good reading of the central shape of the eye so we can get the right first lens. So the capture process is really critical. Spend your time on the initial capture, and this is going to benefit you long term. If you're rushing the capture process, that may mean we send the patient home with a lens that's going to completely and utterly fail, and we have to put on another lens and go through another overnight diagnostic. So it's valuable to put in the time on the capture. One of the principal things that we want to do is get the fissure open up as wide as we possibly can. For instance, if we look at this left image, we see the upper lid blocking a lot of the upper iris. We've got the eyelashes in the way that will hinder the quality of the capture. We really don't understand the shape of the eye up here. Is there anything that would hinder the lens centration? Is the astigmatism apical, or is it limbus to limbus? It's really hard to say. So by getting the lid out of the way, we're going to understand much more of the global shape of the eye. We'll understand that this patient is a more limbus to limbus astigmatism. This may be a candidate for the CRT dual axis rather than the symmetric spherical CRT lens. So get the patient to open up as wide as you possibly can. Now this can be tricky because we can't hold back the upper lid. Then the patient can't maintain normal tear flow, and we won't be able to reflect the placido rings off the cornea. So do the best you can. What you might find valuable is to put the topographer in place and then pull down on the cheek, moving the chin in, forehead slightly back. So you're tilting the head back and opening up the fissure simply by pulling down on the patient's cheek. Another thing that you can try is pulling up on the eyebrows. That will still allow the patient to blink while we'll still be able to open up the fissure a little bit. So a couple things you can try. Now, as we said, pulling down on the lower lid has its value not only in removing the lower lid from blocking the rings and the eyelash shadows, but of course we have a lacrimal lake at the bottom that could create false shape that isn't actually there. So just simply pulling down on the cheek can be a way we can get a lot more coverage on eye. Next, once you've got your photo, you want to focus in on these central rings. What the topographer does, reflection-based topography, is they build the shape and elevation of the eye from the center to the periphery. So the center becomes sea level, and understanding the height, shape, and elevation of the eye all the way to the periphery is critically important to have those quality central readings in order to create the construction that we desire. So zoom in on those central rings and make sure you're not seeing the breakup or distortion of the central 10 to 15 rings especially. That's going to create, or has the potential to create, a significant amount of topographical error. So have the patient blink, smooth out those rings. If you can't capture an image within 2 to 4 seconds after the blink, then ask the patient to blink again. If the tear film breakup is measured in milliseconds, then use some artificial tear to try to smooth out that reflection, smooth out that tear film. On the left is an example of an ideal capture of the topography. Now, what makes this an ideal capture? Number one, we look at each one of the rings. They appear parallel and even, going all the way out to the periphery. Second thing is we've got the lid and eyelash shadows, for the most part, out of the way. And that gives us the ability to interpret all this ring data all the way out to the peripheral cornea. Remember that we're using a 10-6 diameter lens. We're using maybe an 11-0 millimeter lens. So we want this peripheral corneal shape. These peripheral rings are every bit as important as what's happening in the center. Now, once we take that image and we've saved it into the file, that photokeratoscope image is converted to a colorized topography. How do you know that you have a good map? And one of the ways is to look at the contours. All of you have seen many, many corneas behind the slit lamp. You know that a healthy, normal eye has very smooth anterior surface shape. So similarly, the topography should show these beautifully well-rounded contours going from steepest to flattest. You shouldn't see any radical curvature changes, 90-degree angles, or a high point next to a low point. It should appear gradually flattening from center to periphery. That tells me this is most likely a good topography. But to be honest, we never know. If we take only one capture, we have one instance to refer from. Was the tear film even at the moment we took that capture? Was the patient moving at the instance that that photo was taken? We know that the eye is moving in and out with each heartbeat. So there's a lot going on, especially the movement of the tear film. So consider that one capture may not be enough, and any one capture could easily have error. So the way around it is to take multiple readings. When you look at these 4 baseline captures, do they appear reproducible? Are you seeing the same shape 4 times over? Now obviously the first map we might want to throw out. We've got a smaller fissure size, big long eyelashes blocking a little bit of the superior area of the topography. So maybe number 1 and possibly number 3 we would throw out, but I want you to focus on the central shape. Look at the figure 8 astigmatism. It's relatively similar for all 4 of these maps. So centrally there's reproducibility. We could click our cursor right in the center and read the curvature. 4518, 4514, 4525, 4536. So we're within a quarter diopter, or about 0.05 millimeters of curvature in the center. So the topographies are relatively reproducible. Which one would you choose as being your best baseline map? Your map to construct the lens, your map to do your subtraction to compare today versus every visit in the future. And I might suggest map number 2 looks like the smoothest with the largest surface area of coverage. We may also consider number 4. They're both very close. Number 1 and number 3, it's just smaller fissure size. How about here? Do you see 4 topographies that look reproducible? Could you trust building your contact lens based on the shape of these eyes? And map number 1 shows what John Mountford would describe as a divot in the center, a hole in the center of the topography. We're seeing in number 2 this peninsula kind of cutting out the center of the topography. So is that the beginnings of a tear film breakup? Number 3, we have a high point here, another high point here. We've got a 90-degree angle in here. There's all these sort of angular points in the surface indicating the tear film wasn't really all that smooth. Same thing with number 4. We seem to have this piece out of the center. So is that tear film? Or if we were to see this chunk out of the center curvature of the eye, if we saw that 4 times over, we'd say, okay, it's reproducible. It must be the real shape of the eye. Number 4 image, you can also see where the tear wedge, the lacrimal lake down at the bottom, is creating a false steep spot in the curvature. So these are some of the things that we're looking for. We want reproducibility and we want quality images. When you compare the 4 of these, do you see reproducible topography? Do they all appear the same? Is there any one of these maps that you might choose as your baseline? And they all look so similar that I think it would be difficult to choose one over the other. They're all about the same. We click our cursor in the middle, 45.6, 45.5, 45.4, 45.4. They're all well within 1/8 of a diopter, or about 0.02 millimeters curvature in the center. So very reproducible topography. Now, the question is, which map do you spend the most time on when you're in the practice of orthokeratology or CRT lenses? Should you spend the greatest amount of your time on the baseline map or the post-treatment map, or are they both equally important? One of the things you might consider is that the first map is the one that we're going to use to construct our initial CRT lens. So the success moving forward, whether we have initial lens success, is based on that initial map. The second thing you might consider is there is always going to be another post-treatment visit. For as long as you see that patient in CRT lenses, you will always be able to map them again, but you will never be able to have a baseline topography unless you normalize the cornea, and that could take months. So the baseline topography is the most important. It determines your initial lens success, and then it's used to compare the baseline cornea to every visit moving forward till the end of time in CRT lenses. So spend the time on the pre-Orho-k map. Now, for many of you in Australia, the Medmont topographer is one that you use. It seems to dominate the market there, probably because it's manufactured in that country. And there's a unique feature available to Medmont users that allows you to get better coverage when you have these smaller areas of information. So this is a topography where I was able to get the upper lid out of the way, but the eyelash shadows were so significant that it was still blocking so much of the upper cornea. I'm not really understanding the superior corneal shape. And I just couldn't get this lower lid out of the way. The patient was squirmy every time I got near that lower lid or the cheek. So I get a pencil amount of information through the center that isn't really optimal. What you can do with your Medmont is have the patient change fixation. So we do a normal capture of the center. Then we have the patient looking temporal, moving the rings to the nasal side. Having the patient look nasal, move the rings to the temporal side. Have the patient look down, pushing the placido up, and having the patient look up, pushing the placido down. So then all of those individual captures can be converted to a topography, and those topographies can be merged together to create a larger view of the eye. So when Graham's trying to assist with the construction of virtually any contact lens, having a composite map gives him the ability to understand the shape of the peripheral cornea. It gives him the ability to understand where the total diameter of the lens may come to rest on the surface of the eye. Now, another thing to consider is that it's not just one flat K reading that we want to factor in to our construction of the lens. A CRT lens is fit based primarily on two principal meridians, the flattest meridian of the eye, but also the steepest meridian of the eye. So just thinking about the one flat meridian is only part of the story. So something that you might consider is understanding the eye shape beyond what's happening in the center. And one of those things that you could do is to measure sagittal depth. Instead of thinking about the flat K reading, how steep or flat the eye is, why don't we add to our construction what is the depth of the surface along the principal flat meridian, in this case 1541 microns. Let's compare that to the sagittal depth in the steep meridian. This eye has a difference of 32 microns between the depth of the eye along the flat and the depth of the eye along the steep. In other words, the eye is 32 microns deeper running vertically, giving us 32 microns of fluid at 12 o'clock and at 6 o'clock. Let's compare that to a patient with a very similar amount of corneal astigmatism. But this time, instead of an apical astigmatism, we have what's called a limbus to limbus astigmatism, where the hot meridian runs from one side of the eye to the other. If we back up, you can see with your apical astigmatism a very confined figure 8 in the center and almost 360 degrees of green all the way around. So the peripheral cornea is spherical. Whereas with the limbus to limbus astigmatism, you see the green only on lateral sides. It doesn't form a spherical shape in the periphery all the way around. This peripheral cornea is astigmatic. So when you compare the depths in the flat and the steep with a patient that exhibits a similar amount of central corneal astigmatism, we actually have much more depth differential, 95 microns out there in the periphery. So comparing these two eyes with similar corneal astigmatisms gives us completely different shape way out there in the far periphery. And that's important because the far periphery is where your CRT lens is going to land. When your differential between the flat and the steep is under 40 microns, that's typically where a symmetric lens will work. When you have more than 40 to 50 microns of difference between the depth of the eye along the flat and the depth of the eye along the steep, when you're in that greater than 40 micron range, that's where you may want to consider the CRT dual axis. The cornea is too toric out there in the periphery for a symmetric lens to work with a high percentage confidence. You're going to effectively struggle with centration and with the treatment effect, the visual effects the lens might create. Now consider that the CRT lens is built based on depth. You have the base curve of lens chosen in relationship to the refractive change that we wanted. So if we have a central radii of curvature of 43 diopters and we need about 3 diopters effect, then we're going to fit a base curve approximately 3 diopters flatter plus a small fudge factor, maybe 3/4 of a diopter. Now, going out in the lens, from the base curve you reach the optic zone junction at around 6 millimeters, and then you have your reverse curve in your reverse geometry lens. In the CRT lens, that's labeled as the return zone depth. It's labeled according to the depth from the optic zone junction to the landing zone angle or the alignment zone. The next zone out in the lens is your alignment zone, called in the CRT the landing zone angle. So when we drop a lens on eye, it's important to understand, should we be going with a symmetric CRT lens or the toric, also otherwise known as the dual axis. And with this patient with apical astigmatism, we have basically spherical shape, 360 degrees around. The way to view this is on the axial map. The axial map is the best interpretation to appreciate, is it apical or limbus to limbus astigmatism. If your topographer doesn't use the reference of axial, it may be known as sagittal or power map. Now, when you've got a patient with limbus to limbus astigmatism, this is where you want to think about the CRT dual axis. It is most likely going to give you a much better fitting relationship in both the flat meridian and then separately in the steepest meridian of the eye. And what the CRT dual axis does is it creates one return zone depth for the flat meridian while creating a deeper return zone depth for the steeper meridian. That way you can better align with the peripheral cornea. What does that do? Two important things for us. Number one, it will improve centration because you're better aligning to the toric peripheral cornea. The second thing that it'll do is it'll trap that fluid layer in there, creating the appropriate squeeze film forces 360 degrees around. So having the option for the dual axis when we have limbus to limbus astigmatism or higher toricities of corneas, this may be a lens that can help us achieve success where we may not with a symmetric lens. So one of the first things that I do when we look at a potential patient for CRT lenses would be to, number one, check the corneal astigmatism. So what's the central corneal sill? Then the second thing that I would look at is on the axial map, is it apical or is it limbus to limbus like you see here? Then I might consider, if it's limbus to limbus, I might check what is the sagittal differential, between those two principal meridians. Subtract the flat meridian from the steep meridian to determine the differential. In this case, this patient has a 58 micron deeper steep meridian, and it's over our 40 micron threshold that we said would typically be able to manage a symmetric CRT lens. Another way we could look at this is to use the CRT fitting software from Paragon Vision Sciences. And what that allows us to appreciate is the theoretical fluorescein that might exist. We can import in our topography to the CRT software and then understand, will it align across the flattest meridian? And then maybe as importantly, what are we going to have for fluid across the steepest meridian? In this case, we can see a lens that has greater than 50 microns at this point and greater than 50 microns at this point. And this is where we want the lens to land itself down, and it's hanging in air by about 50 microns, or hanging in fluid by 50 microns. So fitting this limbus to limbus astigmatism with 58 microns of difference between the flat and the steep meridian with a symmetric lens, probably not the right way to go. If we were to instead use the dual axis, which gives us a specific depth along the flattest meridian, but then a much deeper depth along the vertical meridian, now we have a 50 micron spread between the depth of the eye along the flat and the depth of the eye along the steep. So there's 50 microns in differential between these two meridians, remembering that this patient had a 58 micron corneal difference between the two. So that will create a much better alignment out there in the periphery to best center the lens and create the appropriate hydraulic forces here in the center. Now another thing you'll want to consider is not just the toricity at the center or the peripheral corneal differential and sagittal depth, but also corneal displacement. That's going to factor into how well our lenses center on eye. So for instance, if we take this cornea, do we see an apex that is really well centered to the visual axis, to the pupil? And the steepest contour appears to be relatively well centered. But remember, your Ortho-k lens is going to vault the central cornea by maybe 5, 7, 10 microns. So it's the periphery where our lens actually lands. So you might focus in on this green-yellow border out here. And is that truly symmetric to the visual axis? And if I run a ruler from the visual axis to this point, it measures 4.06 millimeters. If we go from this point to this point, 4.65 millimeters. So there's a slight displacement of the corneal contour to the temporal side in relationship with where the visual axis is. So we would expect our lens to be slightly temporal of center. Now, not too bad. Wouldn't expect the outcome to be severe, but just something to keep in the back of our minds. When we see the post-treatment topography, do we notice the lens treatment zone or lens centration following the natural displacement in relationship with the visual axis? And notice how your lens is well vertically centered. The treatment zone is well vertically centered, but the blue treatment zone appears farther to the temporal side than it does to the nasal side. And that's because the lens is just following natural corneal displacement. Let's take another example, and we might draw circles around some of the contours where our lens might find its equilibrium. And in this case, the patient appears to have a peripheral corneal shape or cap of the cornea that's decentered a little more temporal on this left eye and inferior. So when we do CRT lenses on a patient like this, we wouldn't be surprised if we saw the treatment zone riding slightly decentered. Now, would we try to modify it? Of course we would. We would try to go larger if we needed a larger diameter to drag it more onto the middle. We might go slightly looser in the alignment zone, the landing zone angle, to bring the lens up, to allow more lid force, to possibly center the lens a little better vertically. But if nothing we try actually centers this treatment and the patient has good visual acuity, then there may be no reason to alter. So have a look at the baseline topography before you make any modifications. It may tell you whether a change is likely to make any difference to the fit at all, or whether you would be fighting nature to improve upon the outcome that you already have. Now, one of the most valuable functions of a corneal topographer is after we've done an overnight trial. And if any of you are like me, fluorescein pattern can be a bit of a mystery at times. Sometimes it can be completely clear that we've got what we want, a lens that's clearing the central cornea, or at least we think it is because it's laterally centering. If this lens were hitting the central cornea, we'd expect more decentration, so that must be clearing. We've got that nice reservoir of fluid surrounded by the alignment zone and then a healthy edge lift all the way around. In this case, do we see a lens that is too flat along the vertical meridian? Is this a patient who requires a CRT dual axis, a toric type lens? So if you're not sure of the pattern, but the comfort and the centration appear not too bad, then you might consider just doing an overnight evaluation. Always prove it out. So if you're not 100% with your fluorescein pattern analysis, don't worry, because the topography will confirm 100%. Now here's an example where we have a one-night treatment in lenses, and you have to make the call on what happened. Is this the ideal, what's referred to as a bullseye? Is this a central island? Do we see central corneal steepening? Is this a smiley face? Do we have an inferior smile decentered too high? Or is it a frowny face? Is it a lens riding slightly low? One single topography map by itself is not the answer. We need something else. Let's switch from an axial interpretation to a tangential interpretation and see if there are any more answers with the tangential map. So here we might look at these rings of paracentral steepening, and would we say that this appears to be a well-centered response? Is it a bullseye? Or was it a central island, as the axial map might suggest? Is it a smiley face, or is it a frowny face? The story here is we cannot use just a post-treatment map by itself. We need more. You don't know what to do with the fit when you look only at the post-treatment. In this case, what is our outcome? Is it bullseye? Should we leave the lens as is? Is it a central island? Should we be going to a lower return zone depth? Is it a smiley face? Should we be increasing the return zone depth or tightening up the landing zone angle? It's not very clear from either the axial or the tangential map. So this is where we'd use what's called the subtractive or the difference map. And this allows us to compare pre and post treatment and have a greater definition displayed on the analysis to understand what's actually going on. Now, the first interpretation you might choose is the axial subtractive map. And the axial tells us the treatment zone position and the refractive change. So when you compare the pre-Ortho-k topography to post-Ortho-k and view the difference on the subtractive map side. So pre-Ortho-k, post-Ortho-k difference map. With the axial interpretation, we can click our cursor right in the center and say this patient had a 0.6 diopter RX change. So we don't have to do a refraction in Ortho-k. If we have a good baseline and a good post-treatment map, the subtractive map will tell us what the actual effect was. So this patient had a very mild 0.6 diopter RX change in one night. That's the first thing we learn. The second thing we learn is looking at this blue-green border in relationship with the pupil. Is this well-centered or is it decentered? And it appears that the blue treatment zone is riding a little bit more up and out in relationship with the pupil. So it appears our lens is riding a little bit high, a little bit outside. So possibly a flat-fitting lens. But let's switch over to the tangential map. The tangential map tells us one very important thing, but only one thing, and that's what is the position of the Ortho-k lens or the CRT lens during sleep. So how do we do that? Let's pull up the larger view and we look at this red ring of paracentral steepening in relationship with the black pupil. And where would you say this lens is centering? We've got the entire red ring inside the black pupil margin down here at 4 or 5 o'clock. We've got part of the red ring above the pupil at around 10 or 11 o'clock. We've got the blue ring, which is where the landing zone angle of the CRT comes down and touches the surface, creating a flattening on the epithelial tissue, and that's slightly inside the pupil, whereas it's about a 0.5 millimeter above up here. We could also say that the ring appears to be more temporal of the pupil, so look at the distance the ring is inside the pupil here versus outside the pupil there. So our tangential map is confirming what the axial map told us. The lens is riding up and out, and we may need to increase the return zone depth or tighten up the landing zone angle, or both. And this is something that Graham from the Contact Lens Center of Australia can be really helpful with. Now, if this reading of the subtractive map is a bit confusing, what we might do is overlay the CRT fluorescein pattern over the treatment zone. So here's our axial subtractive map. We see that blue treatment zone well centered to the black pupil. What actually creates that? And that's where your CRT lens is very close to the surface of the eye, where the tear film is thinnest, creating a compressive hydraulic force. Now, paracentral to that, where you have the reservoir of fluid, that's where you have the greatest suction force pulling on the epithelium, and that's where we see that yellow-orange area of paracentral steepening, created, as we said, by the reservoir of fluid. If we go to the tangential map, kind of a similar story, except there's greater focus on the red ring, as opposed to in the subtractive map, there's greater focus on the blue in the center. So axial map, focus in on the blue treatment zone. Tangential map, focus in on the red and blue rings that surround the center. Now, when we overlay our fluorescein pattern, the red, orange, yellow area is created by this reservoir of fluid, similarly to the axial map. We also see a very defined blue zone, which is where the alignment of your rigid contact lens comes down and touches the surface, where the landing zone angle is in touch with the peripheral epithelium. So we use these subtractive maps to appreciate where the lens is positioning. We use it to understand the RX change, the treatment zone size, the treatment zone position. There are so many valuable things that we can learn from the subtractive map. So never use just the post-treatment map by itself. You have this great tool in all corneal topographers called a subtractive or a difference or a comparison map, and that is the most valuable function in orthokeratology or CRT treatment. The main focus will be on the axial map to give us the RX change, the treatment zone position, and the treatment zone size. The tangential map will be used to understand the lens position in the closed eye environment. Now, let's look at the various outcomes that can happen when we do CRT or Ortho-k lenses. The target, the ideal outcome, is called your bullseye topography. In the bullseye, what we see is a blue treatment zone well centered to the black pupil margin. Next, we can click our cursor in the center and we see the RX change is approximately 3.34 diopters. So this patient had both a well-centered treatment zone as well as an effect of 3.34 diopters myopic reduction in the center. We can switch over to the tangential map, and what we see is the red ring well centered to the pupil. We want these red and blue rings to appear to be relatively centered to the black pupil. If we argued anything in this case, we might say that the lens is slightly low, where we see the red ring touching the superior pupil margin, whereas it's slightly below down here. Now, is this something that we should modify? Should we call up Graham and ask for a landing zone angle slightly looser to bring the lens up? Well, let's go over to our baseline map. Look at the displacement of the green-yellow border. We see that this cornea appears decentered inferior. So this is a decentered apex resulting in a slightly decentered outcome with our lenses. Now, nobody would argue that this lens needs to be modified. It's a beautiful bullseye, but these are some of the nuances that you can begin to understand about centration. Is it slightly low as opposed to 100% centered? And if it's slightly low, is that due to lens displacement, or sorry, is it due to the displacement of the apex of the eye or the cap of the cornea? Now, another outcome that we see in orthokeratology or CRT lenses, thankfully very rarely, is the central island. And what happens in the central island is we create apical steepening. So the central cornea is steepened rather than flattened. And that central steepening is usually surrounded by this blue moat around the island that's an area of flattening around that central area of steepening, and we often see the blue treatment zone decentered slightly in relationship with the pupil. If we move over to the tangential map, it's common to see a red ring decentered low in relationship to the pupil. And we see that here, a red ring over a millimeter inside the pupil at 12 o'clock, at the pupil margin at 6 o'clock. The blue ring at the pupil margin at 12 o'clock, somewhere below, well below a millimeter at 6 o'clock. So this lens is riding low. This is your classic central island outcome, a lens too tight. So in this case, we would reduce the return zone depth, we would reduce the apical clearance, and or Graham may recommend loosening up the alignment zone, the landing zone of the lens to bring it up slightly. Another outcome, and one that we see with greater frequency, is your Smiley face response. And that's where you notice the blue treatment zone decentered high in relationship with the pupil. So the bottom of the blue treatment zone inside the pupil, the top of the blue treatment zone somewhere up here, and that gives us the paracentral smile or the paracentral steepening. Now, we always have paracentral steepening, but the difference is it decentered in relationship with the rest of the treatment area? And in this case, we can easily say that the treatment zone appears high and we've got the smile just kissing the inferior pupil margin. You can click your cursor in the center and notice the patient has a 2.32 diopter refractive change. Often smiley face patients love you in the morning because you've created myopic reduction. You've reduced their myopia. But in the afternoon, they'll notice their vision is fading very fast, and in the PM, in darker conditions, they may notice a lot more aberrations, flare and glare around lights. So centering up the treatment zone is very important for quality of vision. When you look at the tangential map, you see that red ring riding high. It's inside the pupil at 6 o'clock. It's above the pupil at 12 o'clock. The blue ring, where the landing zone angle comes down and touches the surface of the cornea, just below the pupil margin here and well above up here. So our two rings, the red and blue rings, appear decentered high. Our smiley face outcome indicates that we have a return zone depth inadequate for the surface of the eye and or a landing zone angle that's too loose for the surface. One of the last outcomes that you may see is the frowny face, and it's basically the opposite of a smiley face. It's really a bullseye that is just ever so slightly tight. And we notice this beautiful blue treatment area decentered inferior of the pupil. We see that frown that's inside the pupil margin at 12 o'clock. So our whole treatment area decentered slightly low. Now we might ask, is this as good as it gets? Is this what the patient should expect to have based on corneal displacement? So we might wander over to the baseline topography, and do we see contours that would indicate that the lens should ride low? And in this case, we have a pretty symmetric cap of the cornea. We wouldn't expect the cornea to contribute negatively to the centration of our lens in the overnight environment. So I think in this case we might simply have a landing zone angle that's ever so slightly tight, causing the lens to ride a little bit on the low side. Loosening up the landing zone angle will fix this problem up quite easily. Now if we go to the tangential map, we can see the red ring now decentered low and the blue ring decentered low. So I'm sure if you haven't looked at subtractive maps with great detail, you're getting the sense of what we need to do with all of them. Really focus in on the tangential map with this red ring and this blue ring, and with the axial map, focus in on this blue border with the greenish area where the cornea is relatively unchanged. So the subtractive maps are the most important function. Talk to your manufacturer of your topographer. Determine how to pull up a subtractive map. It is the most important function post-treatment that your topographer provides you. You absolutely want it and need it in your analysis of eye shape post-treatment, post-wear of your CRT lenses. It'll tell you when you've got that optimal bullseye. It'll tell you when you have the central island with the slight inferior decentration that it's usually associated with. It'll show you when you've got that big smiley face outcome with a decentered treatment zone high. It'll show you when you've got the frowny face, which is that opposite to the smiley face, slightly low. Now the last thing that we wanted to discuss with you today was the consideration of myopia control and its application. And throughout the world, orthokeratology is being used as one of those mediums, one of those optical interventions to try to control axial growth. And just doing a centered Ortho-k lens may not be the whole story. We need to look at how we distribute power across the surface and how that might contribute to a quality or optimal myopia control situation. So what you might do is pull up your axial map. With the white line across the middle of the treatment area, look at the cross-section of power created. And what you want to determine is within the pupil diameter, how much power shift exists from the center to the periphery. So determining effectively the add that's created from most minus in the center to most plus within the pupil. In this case, this patient has a 1.75 diopter myopic shift from the center to the periphery. And this is what's believed to be one of the mechanisms that contributes to controlling the axial growth of the eye. So making sure we create that optimal myopia controlling shape is one of our considerations when we use Ortho-k lenses for adolescents. And having a flat, low plane shape like this, having very little shift from most minus to most plus, may not be the most optimal myopia controlling shape. Having a more radical shift from most minus to most plus in the periphery is probably what we want to achieve for the vast majority of our kids that we're fitting using Ortho-k for myopia control. So I'd like to thank you today on behalf of Paragon Vision Sciences and the Contact Lens Centre of Australia for tuning in for this webinar. I hope we've answered some of your questions related to how you might use topography pre-treatment as well as how you might use topography post-treatment, and we welcome you to stay on and post questions, and we will try to answer them as a group. So thank you very much.